My name is Brittany Williams. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the National Partnership for Women and Families Economic Justice Policy Council. So my portfolio includes equal pay, non-discrimination, harassment work, paid family and medical leave, and a bit more. But overall, I work on all of those issue areas.
First question, how important is it for Black women in Hollywood to band together and advocate for fair pay and representation?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. So this is so critical, right? And we've already seen it happen. I think the more recent sort of examples are, when Monique came out in 2016, really highlighting just how little she was paid for her role in Precious, even though it brought so much money in at the box office. Viola Davis coming out and saying how like she's won Tonys, Emmys, Oscars, and she still doesn't have the same pay or the opportunities despite all of her accolades. So we've seen, that Black women have come out and have really banded together to advocate for fair pay and representation in Hollywood. But it's also important to note that, Black women have done the work and they're still doing the work. And it is equally important that Black women have allies to band together and to really help advocate for fair pay and representation. Like all of Hollywood needs to be coming together to advocate for Black women and just people of color in general in Hollywood.
What roles do you think the audience play in influencing change regarding fair pay and representation in Hollywood?
Yeah, so I think the audience has a lot more power than maybe some would realize. So a few things come to mind here. So the first thing is just to support Black films, support people of color in films, because a lot of, sort of like the artificial or superficial pushback that Black actresses get is, it's a money thing, and that's why they're not paid for their work. And so when you really have that support and people coming out to support Black films, or just again people of color in films, it really supports their work and sort of pushes back against that notion like people aren't here watching their movies or whatever it is. It's really important that people show up when Black films are in theater. I know now with so many streaming services, right? Like a lot of them are creating sort of like their own shows and movies featuring Black actors. So that's also really important to watch those, because those keep them there and help generate revenue. And again, sort of just like building the sort of portfolio and just highlighting the importance and success of Black actors. And then the sort of last thing here as well is to keep talking about fair pay and representation in Hollywood. Like, this is not a new conversation, especially as it pertains to representation. This has always been an issue. This has always been a conversation, and fair pay as well. But essentially using platforms and having these continued conversations on social media, even with your friends and family too. It's really just sort of a way to, I guess, I don't want to say plant a seed, but sort of, it just sort of gets people thinking about this conversation a little bit more.
Do you have any examples you can share of successful efforts aimed at promoting pay equity and equity in Hollywood?
So a few more recent examples come to mind, but the most recent one was a strike in Hollywood last summer, where I believe the strike was about 4 months long, and it was calling for better pay, working conditions, and AI protections around writers in Hollywood and their work. And they did reach a deal, I believe it was late last summer, but the strike lasted for about 4 months, and they were able to strike a deal that did involve those sort of like three main issue areas. Again, better pay, working conditions, and AI protections. But that was the most recent one, at least here. And then the other two that come to mind, so they're a little bit older, but I don't know if you remember or know, but a few years ago there was, well, actually almost 10 years now, there was the Oscars So White campaign, and that was a social media movement that really began to highlight just how white the Oscars was, not only with in regard to like attendees, but the nominees, the winners. Um, and a few years later, also came like the Emmy So White campaign. So I think with both of these sort of movements, it's really important to note the definition of success. So, for example, both of these campaigns, I know for like the Emmys, like Emmy So White campaign, there were some changes after the movement began. But with both of the campaigns, you know, there were a lot of question of whether like how performative it was, like performative diversity. And so I think in that regard, I don't know that that was much of a success because, just sort of asking Black people to come up and entertain or host, like that's not genuine diversity, or putting up more Black people for like up for nominations, but none of them actually winning an award. I don't know that that would, or many would consider that sort of like the definition of success. But what I feel like is a success here is that, again, like the conversation began. The conversation was, people were starting to have the conversation around just how white these Hollywood institutions are, and really highlighted, I feel like, what a lot of people have known for a very long time, like just how skewed the industry is to non-people of color, and just how limiting it is, and exclusive, really. So yeah.
Do you think the difference of pay can affect the careers of opportunities available for Black women in the industry?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that so for example, in the context of Taraji P. Henson, right? So we have been able to see her track record, again, like Viola Davis, all of her awards, accolades, so many other just brilliant Black actresses. They just developed these extensive track records of like accolade after accolade, like, record after record. And when you are met, despite having all of this like very well known success, and when you're met with this sort of lowball effort or contract or number every time you go to sign a contract for a film, I feel like, and I know Gabrielle Union touched on it, and she was saying like it really calls in a lot of self-doubt. And so with that self-doubt, again, this is sort of like what I've read, but also what I can imagine is like with that self-doubt, you will have these brilliant actresses who end up limiting themselves to specific roles or opportunities, in addition to what Hollywood is already doing, like limiting them and their opportunities because you're constantly being told your lesson. And I mean, even you look at like the history of Hollywood, and the sort of roles that Black women were forced into when they were able to take center stage, it was all just so degrading, so dehumanizing. And so, you know coming from those like forced roles, and then having to work through all of that, work through all the stereotypes that are just ingrained in the industry, but then having built this career of success for yourself, and then having to negotiate it, it is, I can only imagine just how demotivating and just overall hurtful.
In your opinion, what steps can be taken by industry leaders, studio, or organizations to address this problem with Black women being underpaid in Hollywood?
Yeah, so again, a few sort of thoughts come to mind here. So this may be a bit pie in the sky in regards to, what people would expect people to do, but of course I'm still going to say it, that it's really doing the work on internal biases. It's really becoming aware of your surroundings, who is in your circle, who are you working with, like what does your workplace look like? And it's really sort of asking the hard questions from themselves, like how do we have more voices? Like how do we include more people? And I feel like that's just a really, I don't want to say hard step, but a step that a lot of people just don't want to take. They don't want to do that work, and especially in this industry, but I'm going to plug it anyways, and that they need to do the work. They need to do the work as it pertains to internal biases. And then in addition to that, if studio leaders or industry leaders, organizations, and producers are going to be having conversations around pay equity, you need to invite Black women to the table to have these conversations. You can't have this conversation with a table full of white men, like they're not going to have that lens, that perspective. It is important that the people who are impacted are at the table when these conversations are happening as it pertains to creating change in this industry.
So in your article, The Math Isn't Mathin', you looked at the data, and when you seen the data, were you shocked about how low Black women get paid compared to others?
Unfortunately, I was not. For Black women overall and in the United States, I'm not surprised about the wage gap and just how major it is. But for actresses as well, I was not surprised because, again, sort of just Black women overall in the United States and the very pervasive wage gap. So unfortunately, it did not surprise me. And also just as a Black woman who is living in the United States, like I figured as much. I think if anything though, what sort of, I don't know that it necessarily surprised me, but maybe just sort of left me taken aback. When Taraji did her interview, a lot of comments were, people saying, "Oh, I don't want to hear her crying about like her millions of dollars." And I can sort of understand where people are coming from, especially when so many people are really struggling. But at the same time, I think it's a lot of people are missing the key point here, and it's not just about the pay, it's about the principle, it's about equity. And I feel like if anything, I know that I was sort of maybe under an impression that like, celebrities get paid really well. They make a lot of money, but I definitely I was surprised, I guess, in the sense to learn just how different it was, or like when Taraji really sort of went through like how the money is divvied and like what she actually takes home. I think that was more so like the surprising part, but as to her getting paid so much less than her counterparts, that did not surprise me, unfortunately.
At the end of your article, you wrote about Equal Pay Day and Black Women's Equal Pay Day. Can you explain more about this day?
Yeah, absolutely. So, equal pay day, so there are several equal pay days throughout the year, that, are around different, races and ethnicity groups. So we have sort of like the general equal pay day, which, this year fell on March 12th. But that's just sort of like this is what the wage gap is for women overall who are not getting paid equally to like their male counterparts. But for the race and ethnicity specific equal pay days, it highlights how much more time women of this demographic would have to work into the following year to earn as much as their white non-Hispanic counterparts did the previous year. So this year, Black Women's Equal Pay Day falls in July. It will be on July 2nd, but observed July 9th. And so essentially, Black women would have to work an additional 7 months to earn what white non-Hispanic counterparts did last year. And they're all throughout the year. So we have Black Women's Equal Pay Day coming up. There's also Native American Women's Equal Pay Day, and that is as late as November of 2024. So 11 months of additional work to earn what white non-Hispanic counterparts did the previous year.
What are there any things people can do during Equal Pay Day that can help with the situation?
Absolutely. And again, thank you so much for this question. I do feel like there's a lot of power in like a single post. Even if one person sees it, it's just, again, sort of sparking that little bit of conversation or like curiosity around this issue. And I feel like that can really go a long way. And I mean, we've seen it, right? Like we've seen so many movements started and led on social media. So of course, social media has a lot of issues, but I will say that like just being able to be in a space where you can sort of hear or see conversation around that, I think that can be really important. For Equal Pay Day too, I guess this is just sort of like a general plug. So you also have to talk about, like, in addition to talking about the wage gap, it's important to like also advocate for like talking about salary, right? And like again, that can be something that you don't have to do on social media. It's in your workplace. Like talk about what you're earning because a lot of people don't know how much or like if they're getting paid less and if so, like how much. So it's really important. Like that's also like a step that like will help you know, like what you can do during Equal Pay Day. It's beginning to have those conversations on a personal level to help eventually, or like what our goal is to close the wage gap entirely.